I worked for a cleaning company for a little over a year, and I'm convinced that at least 2 buildings that I cleaned in the evenings were haunted. I very easily could have had evidence for a lot of this, but the phone I had during all of this boasted a battery life of about 20 minutes. I'm tearing up just thinking about how awful that was to deal with, and opening the camera almost always immediately killed it. Sometimes it worked, and when it did, I tried to capture evidence, but since the phone itself sucked, none of it is very quality. I also occasionally had a coworker with me, but they each had their own experiences that I will include here. One building was a community activity center, and since these experiences were less terrifying and more unsettling than anything, I'll start here. I cleaned 2 areas, 2 bathrooms and 2 locker rooms. The locker rooms were down the end of a large, dark hall. I could have easily turned lights on in this building every night to make things less creepy, but I wanted to save an extra 30 seconds since I'd be at this particular location anywhere between 1 and 4 a.m. In the men's locker room in particular, I would get a feeling of uneasiness upon crossing the threshold. The room itself seemed safe, but while I was in there, the rooms around me began acting up. I would hear lockers opening and slamming shut in the woman's room next door. There would be the distinct sound of someone sprinting up and down the hall with heavy footsteps. One time I asked for a very specific sign for whatever was there to show itself. I requested that it open 7 lockers on the north side of the men's room. As I walked in, maybe 10 seconds after saying that, I caught the tail end of the motion of 7 lockers right in a row finishing swinging open. I started to cry a little because, I don't know, I didn't really need that at 2 a.m. alone with a very dead cell phone. But before I shakily continued with my work, I said something along the lines of, "Hey, you're valid. This is your space too. Just let me do my work and I'll be on my way without bothering you." After that, I noticed a couple of things. Waiting at the doors where I entered, oftentimes there would be a shadowy shape just sitting there. I don't know, waiting. One time I swear on my life it waved at me. On these nights I felt a presence that seemed there but in the distance, like it respected my space. Possibly the one I spoke to before, but I also noticed there were other feelings there. Some nights I would walk in feeling nauseous, and the closer I got to the areas where my brain told me not to look, inside the gym where I hear footsteps, a dance room with mirrors where I'd see a large figure, and even the bathrooms as a whole, I would feel a pressure on my head, so bad it would set off my tinnitus and even trigger migraines sometimes. One night when I was feeling this pressure and negative energy, I was cleaning the sinks and mirrors, and underneath where my knees were, a cabinet door opened hard on my knee, then slammed shut a second later. The doors were zip-locked shut because little kids put gross stuff in there, so they shouldn't have opened, and when I checked afterward, the tie was still in place and holding the door shut. 2 coworkers of mine also had experiences there. My friend was cleaning one bathroom and I was using the other. While I was out of the room, she heard a sound like a hand running itself along the metal assist bars in the handicap accessible stalls. She also swears she heard footsteps in the bathroom, but no one else was in the building but us. My fiancé, who didn't believe me about any of this, experienced the same cabinet thing I described earlier. Same bathroom, same cabinet, still tied shut. So my big question here, if this place is haunted or whatever, which I'm pretty sure it is, could it have been something to do with the fact that it's pretty much across the street from a cemetery? Could that explain the different, beings that I felt with distinct personalities? Do these sound like average run-of-the-mill ghosts just haunting a building late at night? The second building I want to talk about is much worse. The feeling here was just dark. It stuck with me for hours, sometimes days after leaving, and I had anxiety attacks when I thought of having to be there. It was only twice a week, thank God, at the local USDA building. It's just a little place, maybe 15 desks total. Took at most 2 hours to clean, but they were the worst 2 hours of my life every single week. It started out as kind of a gross feeling, like I was being watched. My shoulders were tense, accompanied by what almost felt like fingers on my back and neck. I felt sick, often walked away with a headache, that sort of thing. It got slowly worse over a while. I'd hear an odd clunk in another area of the building, maybe a door would shut somewhere. Things I could explain away at the time. Things that had rational explanations but still left me feeling shaken. During the time, it wasn't horrible, but the little creepy things and the noises has definitely picked up in frequency. By the way, I'd start seeing shadows that would dart out of rooms as soon as I'd look at them directly, which is to say the least unnerving. I sent a friend a Snapchat of the room in general. Nothing spooky, just complaining about being at work. She replied telling me that if I ever sent her another photo of that place, she would block me. She's very into supernatural stuff, and she claims she has a ghost in her house that just kind of hangs around. I don't know, that just put me on edge. It must have angered whatever dwells there that someone did want contact with it, because things got a lot worse after that, really fast. One night that I will never forget, I actually thought I might legitimately die there. The sick feeling was immediate upon opening the door, like the air was thick with it. By my supply closet door in the dark, since I hadn't turned on the light yet, it looked like a huge trash bag was lounging in the hall blocking my path. I averted my eyes because I was already terrified and turned the light on. The shape was gone. Nothing could have cast the shadow in this virtually empty hallway. When I went to open my closet door, it was hard to pull open, as though something was forcing it back shut. I gathered my supplies and walked away to begin my job and move on, and the door slammed shut. I kept cleaning, 'cause I had to, otherwise I would have gotten right out of there, and continuously felt a hot breath on my neck that I heard over the music blaring in my headphones. At one point, I heard the rattle of a rattlesnake, but of course, after thoroughly investigating, I found no snake was in the building. I probably would have rather have found a snake, though. The door slamming sounds happened several more times throughout the couple of hours that I was there, and that was always jarring. However, it was somewhat easy to brush off and ignore after a minute since I was so used to it by then. But when I was walking in front of the door's another glass, I noticed in the reflection there was another me behind what was actually my reflection. It moved a half a second slower than me and was placed several feet behind me. I even heard the footsteps and felt something there behind me, but I was too scared to look. Overall, it was just wrong. I avoided looking in most reflective surfaces after that until the day I quit. Later, when I was cleaning the bathrooms, I noticed a sink turning on without me being anywhere near it. Not a motion sensor, mind you, but a good old handle-turning sink. One that should under no circumstances turn itself on. The mirror was also dirty again, even though I just cleaned it. It kind of looked like someone clawed at the mirror with soap on their fingers. Thankfully, the bathrooms were the last part of my night, and I rushed out and had a really nasty anxiety attack in the car. My previously mentioned friend also cleaned here sometimes. She also experienced the nasty feelings I was talking about, even down to the headaches. One night, she didn't want to work alone there. It was so scary, guys. I'm telling you, I often couldn't go alone despite company rules, so she brought her boyfriend. When she was cleaning the bathroom, the same one with the faucet incident, she began feeling hot breath on her neck. Then she heard her boyfriend from the entrance of the bathroom ask, "You okay in there, babe?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm fine." Then her necklace, which is I think the Virgin Mary and was blessed by a priest, got hot and she left the bathroom. Her boyfriend was sitting in another area of the building entirely and had not spoken to her or left his spot. He couldn't have talked to her at the bathroom doorway. What I'm wondering is, what was that? I've never felt so scared, and the blessed necklace thing nauseates me every time I think about it. Please help me figure out what that was. Am I still in any danger of that following me around, since I interacted with it and took photos of it? I just want some thoughts. I quit a month ago and still feel uneasy when I think about, or even just drive, past this building. This happened to me several years ago while I was living in California and working a great job in a coffee house downtown. I loved everything about that job. I worked with fantastic people, and our shop was located in the city's historic district in a very, very old, beautiful building that had once been a hotel in the 1800s. but had since been converted into apartments, lofts, and, of course, the big coffee house on the main floor. Being an early birdie and living only a couple of blocks away from the coffee house, I was always secluded to work the opening shift, which started at 4:15 a.m. It was always the most unpopular shift, but it happened to be my absolute favorite one because I loved walking to work in the quiet of the early mornings as the rest of the city was sound asleep. Normally downtown was quite loud and busy, full of people and constant activity, but in the early hours of the morning, it was still and silent, and I felt as if though I was the only person in existence walking through a ghost town. Every day I arrived about 10 or 15 minutes early for my shift and would wait for my manager on the patio outside of the shop. It was always just the two of us working that early shift, and my manager was often running a little bit behind and never arrived before I did, but I didn't mind at all. I liked to spend some time by myself on the patio outside of the darkened shop, gathering my thoughts while I waited for him to walk up with his keys to unlock the doors. One morning, as I was walking to work and approaching our building, I noticed that the coffee house was brightly lit up, as all the lights were already turned on and shining through the store's giant glass windows. I was about 10 minutes early that morning, so I was very surprised to see that my manager had arrived before me and had already started opening up the shop. I walked up to the glass door and pulled on the handle to let myself in, only to find that it was locked shut. That wasn't really unusual, as we often kept the doors of the employee entrance and main entrance locked while we got everything ready for the day and went through our morning procedures until 5 a.m., which was our official opening time. What was unusual, though, was the sound of music I could clearly hear drifting through the speakers inside the store. This was during the holiday season, so we were playing Christmas music throughout the day, but we never turned it on until around 9 or so in the morning, out of respect for all of the tenants living in the apartments above us. But on this particular morning, I could hear the Christmas music already playing its familiar loop at a rather high volume inside the store. I thought it was odd, but decided that maybe my manager was just feeling extra festive that day and wanted to listen to some tunes while we worked. I knocked on the employee entrance door and waited for my manager to come and let me in. I looked through the glass and watched for him. He didn't come, so I knocked again and waited some more. He still didn't appear, so I knocked again and again. I then walked to the main entrance doors and tried knocking on those with no luck. I checked my watch and saw that I had 5 minutes until I needed to clock in. I knocked again, much louder this time, and looked inside through the glass door for any signs of my manager. And that's when I heard the muffled sound of voices coming from the back of the store where the kitchen of our coffee shop was located. At that quiet, early hour in the morning, everything seemed to sound amplified, and what I could distinctly hear was two male voices talking and laughing together. That was very unusual, as I had mentioned before that it was normally just me and my manager who opened up the shop, but I figured someone had probably just needed to pick up an extra shift. I knocked yet again and continued to listen to the sounds coming from the coffee shop. The men kept talking and laughing loudly. They seemed to be having a really great time. In addition to the music and the talking and the laughter, I began to hear the sound of clanging dishes and also the sprayer of the 3-compartment steel kitchen sink being turned off and on, which was very, very unusual as there would be no dishes to wash before the store had even opened. I was also confused as to why my manager, and whoever was with him, were in the kitchen in the back of the store because so much of our opening procedures, setting up the pastry case, brewing the coffee, preparing everything for the espresso machine, were done at the front of the store, where I was waiting to be let inside. At this point, I was getting a bit irritated as I was supposed to start work in just a few minutes and needed to punch in on our time clock. I hated clocking in late for work. I dug out my phone and dialed my manager's cell phone. He didn't pick up, so I dialed the number to our coffee shop instead, and the 2 phones inside the shop, one in the back office and one up front by the register, started ringing. Once, twice, 3 rings and no answer. Now 4 rings and 5. I hung up and immediately dialed again, annoyed that they were making such a racket in there with all the music and all the talking and the laughter that they probably couldn't even hear the phone at all. Just as before, nobody answered. I hung up and redialed the store for the 3rd time. The phone rang and went unanswered, so I banged on the door yet again, to no avail. I looked at my watch. I was officially late for work. As I was standing in front of the locked door with my phone against my ear, becoming more and more irritated, I noticed a pair of headlights reflecting in the glass, rolling up behind me. I turned around and saw something I didn't expect at all. It was my manager. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he said as he climbed out of the driver's seat and shut his car door and hustled up to the shop's entrance. "I tried to get here as fast as I could," he said as he moved toward me and fumbled with his keys trying to find the one to the shop door. "You're mad," he said. "I can tell. I'm really sorry." Completely confused, I put my phone away and turned to head into the store with him, and that's when I lost my breath for a minute. The coffee shop was totally dark. None of the lights were on, not one single light, and it was dead quiet. The Christmas music had stopped, and so had the voices and laughter. All of the loud noise had disappeared. Every sound I had been listening to just seconds before had suddenly vanished. "I promise I'll be here on time tomorrow," my manager said as he fit his key into the lock. "I'll even be early. You'll be shocked." Little did he know that I could not possibly be more shocked to see him than I was at that very moment as he opened the door to the silent, completely empty coffee house. The first story centers on my maternal great-grandmother, who emigrated from Norway to the United States in the 1920s and would sometimes travel back across the ocean to visit her family for a period of time. During these trips, she would have her neighbors watch over her house, water the plants, collect the mail, etc., while she was away. Her neighbors were very good and reliable people and were always happy to lend her a hand whenever she needed some help. On one such trip, my great-grandmother planned to be staying with her family in Norway for a month and asked her neighbors to take care of her house while she was away. They told her that, of course, they would watch after her house for a while she was out of the States, and that it would be no trouble at all looking after her things. So my great-grandmother left them with a house key and headed back to her Norwegian homestead to see her family with one less worry on her mind. A month passed and my great-grandmother returned home from her trip, but when she arrived back at her house, she was very surprised to find that her neighbors seemed to have not taken care of anything for her at all. Her mail had not been collected and neither had her newspapers, and when she walked inside, she found that her plants were completely dry and many had not survived her week-long absence. She was confused as to why her neighbors had not looked after her house as they promised they would, as they had done for several times before. But it was late in the evening and my great-grandmother was tired from her travels, so she decided to head to bed and talk to them about it in the morning. The following day, my great-grandmother knocked on her neighbor's door, and when they answered, she greeted them and told them that she had returned from her trip. They said, "Yes, we know that you've been home and we saw that you had returned early." This confused her, as she had returned home at the time that she had originally planned to arrive. She told them that she had only just come home the previous night. Her neighbors were very surprised at this news and insisted that she had been home for several weeks. They told her that they had taken care of her house for the first 3 days, but when they came over on the 4th day, they found her shoes, the very shoes my great-grandmother was wearing on her feet at that moment, placed in front of the main door where she always left them. Norwegians don't wear shoes in the house, and further, they distinctly heard her inside the house, the unmistakable sound of her footsteps moving through the rooms. They assumed that her trip had been cut short as they continued to see and hear her going through her normal household routines from that point forward. During the days that followed, her neighbors swore they heard her cleaning, heard pots and pans and dishes clanging around in the kitchen as she cooked, saw her opening and closing windows, saw lights being turned on and off in the nights, and watched her silhouette move all through the house, just as they always had. They also saw her outside of her house, sweeping the front porch and walking through her front and backyards, tending to things she normally did. Everyone was beyond confused at this point. My great-grandmother was 100% certain that she was across the ocean in Norway for a month, and her neighbors were 100% certain that she was home the entire time. The second story centers around my maternal grandmother and my aunt, who had an extremely close relationship. My aunt had been living in Arizona for a few years, but she and my grandmother, who lived in New Mexico, spoke to each other regularly on the phone, sometimes daily, but at least once a week. One particular month, my aunt had been very, very busy with work and had not been able to speak with my grandmother on the phone for a couple of weeks. This was very out of the ordinary for her to not call my grandmother for such a long time, while she simply did not have the time, being so absorbed in her job. One morning, my aunt arrived at work. As she was getting ready to begin her shift, she crossed paths with one of her coworkers in the hallway. The coworker stopped her and said, "You need to call your mom. She was just here looking for you, and she's really upset and worried about you." My aunt thought she had misunderstood her coworker and said, "You mean my mom called here looking for me?" Her coworker told her that no, she hadn't called. She had just been right there inside the building looking all over for her aunt. This was not possible, as my grandmother was hundreds of miles away in New Mexico. She explained this to her coworker, who continued to insist that my grandmother had definitely been inside the building and had in fact just left only a few minutes prior to my aunt's arrival. Still thinking her coworker must be mistaken, my aunt opened her wallet and pulled out a picture of my grandmother and showed it to her, asking if this was the woman who she had just spoken to. Her coworker immediately recognized her and said she was definitely the same woman. My aunt was extremely confused at this point, so she found the nearest phone and dialed quickly. After the first ring, my grandmother picked up the phone, hundreds of miles away in New Mexico, and told my aunt how worried she had been about her and how relieved she was to finally hear from her. The last story centered around me. I was out shopping for some new clothes one afternoon and was sifting through some shirts on a rack inside a thrift store when a woman came up behind me and said excitedly, "I thought that was you. Hi, how have you been?" I turned around and looked at her bright, smiling face and had absolutely no idea who she was. Absolutely none. I had never seen her before in my life, though she seemed quite certain that she knew me. She must have read the expression on my face because she said, "Do you remember me? From the festival last week, we met in the parking lot." I was still drawing a complete blank, and I definitely had not been to our town's summer festival the week before, where she thought we had met. I told her that she must be mistaking me for someone else, but she was adamant that she had met me in the parking lot after the festival was over. She said that she had been drinking during the festival, but she was sure it was me who she had crossed paths with that night. She said I had slipped her keys out of her hand just as she was about to get into her car and had convinced her not to drive home until she had sobered up a little bit, and that I had spent the next several hours sitting and talking with her in that parking lot, having a deep discussion about life. I told her that I was very sorry, but I just was not who she thought I was, as I didn't go to our town's festival that year, and in fact, I didn't ever go out at nights at all. At first, she seemed to be frustrated and a little insulted that I couldn't remember her, but then she seemed to be genuinely hurt about it, and I felt terrible that she thought I was simply pretending not to know her. She said, "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for not letting me drive that night." And then, as she turned to leave, she said, "It was really good to see you again." Not long after that, I encountered another person who I had never met before who was, again, quite certain that he knew me. I was delivering groceries to a husband and wife who had recently reached out to our church looking for some help. They had fallen on some very hard times, and the husband was struggling with cancer and was extremely ill. The wife had contacted our church and asked if we had any food at all that we could spare. So we got a load of groceries together for them, and I was helping to deliver the bags of food to the couple's house. When I stepped inside their front door, the wife greeted me and was showing me the way to the kitchen, when I noticed her husband fast asleep in the living room on the couch. He was very frail and hooked up to an oxygen tank. I was trying to be as quiet as possible as not to disturb him, but as his wife was showing me into the house, he opened his eyes and sat up on the couch. He looked at me and his face just lit up. He says, "Oh, it's you. I remember you." I did not remember him at all. He was a complete stranger to me, and this was the first time I had ever seen him. He said, "I met you that night after I got diagnosed with my cancer. You were in the parking lot at the church, and you talked to me all night long about life." He said, "You made me feel so much better." I could tell it was difficult for him to speak, and I did not want to correct him and tell him that he was mistaken, that it was most definitely not me who he had spoken to that night. So instead, I let it be and just smiled at him. And just like the woman in the thrift store, he told me, "It's really good to see you again," before he laid himself back down on the couch and closed his eyes. As a child, I moved a lot. My mother couldn't ever really settle in one place. Although we'd often leave my hometown, we'd always end up back there, and this time was no different. I was 10 and we had lived in a different town with my mother's boyfriend. However, they broke up after a very abusive relationship, and after living in a woman's shelter, my mother grabbed the first house she could find back in her hometown. The house was a pretty normal house for a cotton mill town, Darwin, UK. It was a terraced house, small, with 2 bedrooms, dining room, living room, and an extension with a kitchen. At the very end of the kitchen, the only bathroom in the house. My mom's sister, C, only lived 2 streets away with my 6 cousins, so I was very excited to be back with them after living in another town where I knew no one. We moved in without even looking at the house, as Mom was so ready to be out of the shelter. At this time, my mother was about 5 months pregnant with my brother. I think she just wanted to find somewhere to settle, ready for his arrival. The house wasn't in good condition. It was really damp and it smelled very strongly of mold. The carpets were old, it was a rental, and the wallpaper was falling off the walls. But a home is a home, I guess. The first night was scary. I had been used to moving around so much, so I was used to first night nerves. But this felt different. My room was very small, just enough space for a single bed to go along the wall, so my feet, or head depending on which way I decide to sleep, would be pretty much against the door frame. I had decided to sleep with my feet by the door so that I could keep my eye on the door, which was open as my mom had asked me to leave it open so she could check in on me. The whole night I sat under my covers with my eyes firmly on the door. I could feel someone watching me. I got no sleep that night. The next night, my mother's boyfriend moved in. Not the abusive one, another ex that she had got back with, a pretty good guy. The whole feeling of the house got worse once he moved in. We'd be sat watching TV and hear walking upstairs. We'd hear things moving, taps running in the kitchen, but when we looked, they'd be off. Lights would turn off and on. One night I woke to see someone standing outside my doorway. I couldn't see features or even a gender. It was late and dark. I assumed it was my mother checking on me. I watched the figure move towards the stairs and go down, so I got up, thinking it was my mom, and I was far too creeped out in the house to go downstairs alone at night, so I thought I'd go down whilst she was there to get a drink. However, as I got to the top of the stairs, I couldn't see any lights on downstairs. Thinking it was odd, I checked in my mom's room right next to the top of the stairs, and both my mom and her boyfriend were in bed asleep. I very quickly went back to my room and closed the door. After a few weeks, we discussed the creepy things happening and the feelings we felt in the house. My mom decided that we'd look for somewhere else to move. My mom's boyfriend had things thrown at him in the house and heard breathing in his ear one night when he fell asleep on the sofa. Moving day came. The men in our family decided they'd do the moving. My mom's boyfriend, 2 of my uncles, and a family friend all went into the house to start moving the boxes to the van. I was at my aunt's 2 streets away, so this day I didn't see what happened with my own eyes. But all of the men in our house left the house within an hour and refused to go back in. Apparently, a male voice told them to get out, and one of them was pushed down the stairs. In the end, my mom, my Aunt C, and I ended up doing the moving because they flat out refused to go near the house. My mom's boyfriend even told her to just leave the stuff and he'd buy her new stuff. After we moved out, my other Aunt S, who my mother doesn't really talk to, said how she lived in that house for a short time in the 80s, and it was one of a number of houses in the town that offered rooms to addicts. She had said a few people had died from overdosing in that house and that she had paranormal experiences in her short time there. I wish I could find more about the house. I don't even remember the house's number. I know the street name, but the house is long gone. It was knocked down in the mid-2000s, and now there are new houses there. Although I'd love to know if whoever lives in that house that stands on that land now has had experiences. I've had experiences in a number of homes I've lived in, but that was the only one I felt was truly evil. I've always believed in ghosts and the paranormal. I've never been able to see spirits, but I can feel their presence and their emotions. When my son, who is autistic, was 3, he's now 12, we lived with his dad's sister in a huge house. I don't know how old the house is, but one day, my son and I were home alone and we were in our room playing. I was grabbing him by the ankles and flipping him over on the bed. We've been doing this for about 30 minutes. All of a sudden, my son starts looking past me to the corner of the room and looks terrified. I should also mention that he was completely nonverbal until the age of 6. He grabs the blanket and throws it over his head. I pull the blanket off his head and say, "What are you doing, silly?" Still looking past me and still looking terrified, he puts the blanket back over his head. I pull it off again and ask him what's wrong. He points behind me. I turn around, but I don't see anything, so I tell him, "Mommy doesn't see anything." He then looks even more terrified and puts the blanket back on his head. Again, I pull it off, and this time I ask him what he sees. He makes a motion like to demonstrate someone hanging and makes a face with his tongue hanging out. This time, I don't let him put the blanket back over his head. I tell him to wait a minute. I turn around in the direction he's been looking and say out loud, "Look, I understand you're probably trying to communicate with my son because you realize he can see you. But he knows I can't see you, so it's scaring him, and he's autistic. I need you to leave, please." I watch my son's gaze follow from that corner of the room all the way to the door. He then looks back at me with a big smile on his face, claps his hands, and is ready to play again. If I hadn't been a believer before that day, I definitely would have been after that. I spend a lot of time at cemeteries, and my girlfriend is constantly bringing flowers and toys to forgotten children. We also love to thrift shop for old dolls, pictures, and books. The creepy or more unusual, the better. I guess I'm just trying to make it clear that I frequent many places where spirits might be and bring all kinds of weird things into my home. I also want to make it clear that I am always very cautious to be respectful. I feel like I need to add that I am polyamorous and have both a husband and a girlfriend. The story may get a little confusing without this information, as we have each experienced some things. Strange things have been happening at home. Each time my husband has tried to convince us that there is a logical explanation. I'll try to break down each incident as well as what we think could have logically happened. Incident 1. The first things we experienced were weird noises. We would be in bed and it would sound as if though someone was in the closet moving hangers around. We would hear things like this constantly, and then upon investigating, we couldn't find anything. During Halloween, I had hung plastic around my living room, giving it the feel of a creepy circus tent. This plastic has a very distinct sound when someone rubs or brushes against it, and we would hear this rustling constantly, but never when we were in the room. Pretty creepy. My husband tried to convince us that the breeze happened, but my girlfriend wasn't so convinced. Incident number 2. I make little nude clay sculptures as a hobby, and they take quite a bit of time and are pretty detailed. So I will work on them for weeks or months sometimes, and while doing so, I just leave them out on my working mat. Recently, I started coming home and pieces would be cut. The first time it was the middle of one of my woman's torsos. My husband's explanation was that the clay simply got too heavy and pulled apart right down the middle. This seemed logical, but now it's happening all the time. I came home and one of my sculpture's thighs were cut in half. Incident number 3. I went thrifting on a Wednesday at my local place and I got a really cute skirt that I tried on at the store. I am always super careful to check out any defects. As an avid thrifter, I have made the mistake before. The skirt seemed perfect and I planned to wear it to dinner the next evening. I left it out so that I could wash it before we went out, but when I got home, the waistband had been cut. Not torn, a perfect little cut. My husband suggested I might have missed this at the store. It made me roll my eyes. I am a pro. I will spend 6 to 8 hours in the same thrift store. It's like he doesn't even know me. I just know I would not miss something like that, but logically, I must have. Incident number 4. I woke up in the middle of the night to pee, not something unusual, and when I opened our bathroom door, I found the shower curtain on the floor. The end of the rod was unscrewed, and it just totally freaked me out. Our bathroom door is literally in our bedroom, and I am convinced I would have heard the shower curtain and rod fall on our cement floor. By this time, I'm freaking a little. Incident number 5. So technically this is 2 different experiences, but I will list them as they had happened on the same night. I was about to fall asleep when I heard my girlfriend ask my husband, "What did you say, Chad?" She swears she heard him say something, but he was fast asleep on the other side of me. Later that night, I woke with someone's hand on my shoulder from behind me. My arms were wrapped around my girlfriend, who I was spooning, and I assumed the hand was my husband's. I just remember it very heavy. After a few seconds, my mind realized that my husband's arm was around mine and my girlfriend's wrist, and that he couldn't be touching my shoulder. I literally jumped so hard it woke my girlfriend. We convinced ourselves that I must have been dreaming. Incident number 6. This is where things get even weirder. My husband woke up a few mornings ago to find the top surface of our bedroom dresser soaked in water. His PlayStation 4 literally had water pouring out when we picked it up to clean the mess. I'm 100% sure the substance was water. I smelled and even tasted it in the name of science. We have gone through every possible explanation as to how this could have happened. There were no cups, glasses, bottles, or anything containing water anywhere near the dresser. There is no damage to the ceiling, no leak. It's not under any vent or fixture, and we have cement flooring. The amount of water was pretty insane. All the clothes in his top drawer were wet as well. However, there was no splashing. The carpet and surrounding areas were bone dry. Now even my husband is freaked out. This morning, as I went to leave the apartment, I turned off the light under the kitchen cabinets. As I turned to leave, the light flipped back on. I didn't bother switching it back. I was a little freaked, so I just left. I guess I should mention my girlfriend has saged and used Palo Santo wood in the apartment and asked anything that may be there to leave. This is before the water incident. I'm sure I'm leaving out some things, but I wanted to give a quick outline of what's happening. I feel like this mostly has been directed at me, except maybe the PlayStation thing. We all spend an equal amount of time on it, so I can't really say. Any advice would be great. I'm a 25-year-old female living in a small town in Idaho. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. Obsessed might be a better word. Despite my fascination, I've only encountered a few instances in person, and the following recollection is one of my favorites to tell. The story in which this happened and the names of the coworkers involved will be kept anonymous, even though the store had been closed, for no other reason than to protect the company which I no longer work for. At the time the story took place, I was 20. Me and my boyfriend had just moved to Twin Falls, Idaho for a career opportunity. I had landed a management job doing signage and shipment for a retail store that happened to be located right along the canyon's edge. We packed up what little we had and moved with very little notice to a place we had never been. We found a small, very run-down apartment in a not-so-nice part of town. It was all we could afford at the time, and I had truly thought I would make it big here. This new job was our ticket to a better life. It was December, very close to Christmas time, although I can't remember the exact day. The holidays are a very rough time for retail workers, as the business picks up immensely. Due to this, so did the hours of operation. On this particular night, we were open until midnight, and I was tasked with the closing shift. I remember feeling this was very unfair because I would be the one opening at 7 a.m. the next morning. The way the closing shift worked, we would have 4 people scheduled from 2 to 10, then 2 people scheduled from 6 p.m. to 1 in the morning. We would adjust this as needed, but it was a Tuesday and half of the night shift had already been sent home due to slow business, so when I arrived, only 2 people were in the store. The night manager, let's call her Jess, and my closing cashier, we'll call her Kim. I had only been working there a few months, and I had somehow managed to get on the night manager's bad side. Looking back, I'm sure I wasn't the easiest person to get along with, as I took my job very seriously and the others really didn't. Jess had been working there for a very long time and clearly disliked me. She was known for being a bit of a prankster. She had made it her life's mission to be a nuisance to myself and the other employees. She would be hiding behind corners, in dressing rooms, and anywhere she could out of sight in order to scare someone. I, however, was not easily scared. I'm horribly anxious all the time and constantly on guard. Besides, I could usually hear her snickering from across the hall. This infuriated her. It was as if scaring me was her personal responsibility. All of this is important to events that would follow. She was more than eager to leave the moment I stepped in the store. She grabbed her things, clocked out, and left at 10 without saying more than a brief greeting or goodbye. I was fine with this, as conversations with her were like pulling teeth. The store was quiet for the entire evening. No more than a few customers stopped in, and the night felt like it was dragging on. That was until it was time to close. As soon as the clock hit midnight, I did my nightly check, walking from the back of the store through each dressing room, the bathrooms, the employee area, around each department, and up to the registers, checking to make sure there was no one left. I conducted this walk every night, and I did this thoroughly. The point of this check is to make absolutely certain no one had still been in the store. Once I made it to the register, I informed my cashier, Kim, that we would get out early as I had to work again in the morning. She agreed, put in one headphone, turned off the horrible Christmas music everyone hated, and began to sweep up. I grabbed her till tray, the only one left open, and proceeded to the back office to count down and finish the paperwork. As I made my way back, I glanced over each department one more time to check for customers. Looking back, I don't know why I did this. I usually don't. I trust my checks, but that night I felt like someone was still in there. This bothered me to the point I did my check again, just to be certain. I didn't see anyone and returned to the office. This store was a fairly large warehouse-style building with concrete floors and tall rafters in the center of a shopping complex. Being here after close always gave me a weird vibe, but especially tonight. I summed it up to the falling snow outside, sleep deprivation, and working long hours. However, I would never mistrust this gut feeling again. Every employee was required to wear a clip-on walkie-talkie with a wired headset. This was the main way we would communicate with each other. These headsets were known to pick up interference and act up on a regular basis, and tonight would not be any different. I was typing up some numbers, completely focused in what I was working on, mostly just rushing to get out as soon as possible. The headset cackled to life, sending a loud mesh of static voices into my right ear. The static was loud enough to make me jump, almost completely out of my seat. I muttered curses under my breath and turned the volume all the way down. As soon as I resumed my work, I noticed the familiar sound of jingle bells ringing from outside the office. I rolled my chair back and leaned backwards out the door. The music had been turned back on, merrily and rather loudly playing jingle bells. I picked up my headpiece and called out for Kim. She answered in a confused tone, asking why I turned on the music. The controller for the music was up at the front registers, and I had no way of turning it on from where I was. What? I didn't touch the music. You're the only one up there. Why did you turn it on? I asked, rather annoyed. Kim had always minded her own business. She wasn't well liked among the crew either, and stayed out of just as little vendetta against me. All this intermingled drama was quite common for a business full of girls. Her silence at my question was even more irritating, but I watched on the store cameras as she quickly turned the store music off. We both continued with our work. Less than 3 minutes passed, and the walkie-talkie crackled to life again. I looked back at the cameras, a symphony of static in my ear. This time a familiar voice broke through the noise. "Can you hear me? Please?" Static overtook the voice. Walkie... home?" The words broke through with static in between. It was common to hear static over the walkies, but never voices like that. I pressed the small button on the headset. "Jess?" I knew that voice anywhere. She sounded almost panicked. "What? No one else is in here, it's just us." Kim's voice, clear as day through the headset. No static. "Didn't you hear that?" I asked, watching Kim move slowly over to the center of the store on the camera. No, I didn't hear anything. She looked visibly confused on the camera, spinning around, searching each department. The walkie crackled yet again. Please, is anyone there? This was much louder and more clear. There was no way Kim wasn't hearing this. She resumed her work as I watched her closely. She hadn't taken a side on the drama in the store, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to. I grinned at the camera. Well played, Jess. I almost laughed out loud. This woman would stop at nothing to spook me, but staying 3 hours past her shift to make it happen? That seemed like a little bit of a stretch. But if she wanted to scare me that badly, I suppose this was a good time to do so. I calmly stood up from my chair, stretched, and grabbed my bottle of water off the counter. If she did in fact try to jump out at me when I found her, she was going to get a face full of water. My mind was racing with where she could have hidden. I was almost certain that I had checked every nook and cranny when I did my walk. Maybe she had left, and managed to sneak back in using her store key. These racing thoughts stopped instantly as I made my way out of the office. The table that held the charging ports for the walkie-talkies was right outside the office. Glancing at the receiver, I noticed only 2 walkies were missing, mine and Kim's. We didn't have any extras, 6 in total and 4 sat charging. The lights all flashing green, indicating that they were fully charged. My overactive imagination began running scenarios through my head as I made another walk through the store. Searching every room, every corner, the bathrooms, the rafters, even under displays and between racks, everywhere. I took a peek outside the front doors. A thick blanket of snow had fallen over the dim parking lot, and the only 2 cars in the entire stretch of the canyon were ours. No footprints in the snow, as we hadn't had a customer almost all night. I shook my head and went back to the office. I summed up the noise as interference and began closing out the day. It was almost 1 a.m. and I wanted to go home. I closed the door and turned back to my paperwork, but not before suddenly getting the strong urge to look at the front camera. Something caught my eye. There, standing next to the register, was Kim, standing perfectly still, her head turned towards the front corner of the store by the main entrance. She stood so still for a moment, I thought the security system had crashed. I watched the scene for a moment and caught the steady snow falling out of the front window. She held a broom in one hand and held completely still as if frozen in time. I stood up slowly to get a better look at what she was looking at. Suddenly, she dropped the broom, spun on her heels, and began sprinting towards the back office. This girl was by no means fit. I had never seen her move faster than a brisk walk, but she was sprinting. Leaning forward, her headphones bouncing wildly behind her, I shot up from my seat and opened the office door for her. She sped right past me, almost ran into the counter, spun around, and slammed the door behind us. Completely out of breath, I stared her up and down. "What is wrong with you?" My heart felt like it was pounding as hard as hers. She was white in the face and her eyes were tearing up. There's something up there. There's a man in the store." Her voice was very high-pitched and she was almost choking on her breath. Her eyes were wide and there was no hint of humor in them. I leaned forward, glaring at her. This girl was terrified. This wasn't a prank. At least if it was, Kim was not in on it. She was legitimately afraid. At this point, all my alarm bells started going off. Twin Falls was hardly a safe town, as I had decided to move there at a rough time where drug problems and homelessness seemed to be at an all-time high, even for such a small town. I whirled around to search the cameras. Fight or flight mode had officially been activated, and my main priority now was to keep my employees safe. I began switching through channels. There was nothing on the cameras. Kim steadied her breath and pointed to the front doors, slightly to the left. "That's where I saw him. A tall man, I think, in a big black overcoat. The coat almost touched the floor." I kept looking. Nothing. Sifting through each channel over and over. "He's wearing, like, a top hat." I stopped. Suddenly I was frozen, staring at my hand on the mouse. A top hat. I turned back to look at her. She was visibly shaking and crying. "I'm not seeing him," I said, looking her over and over. She shook her head. "I don't think you can see him on those." I nodded. The only way out without setting the fire alarms off was through those doors. If there was someone in the store, he would certainly see us leaving. But I hadn't seen anyone. Something wasn't right for certain, but if it was just someone playing a prank, and I called the police, I would certainly get in trouble. On the other hand, if there was actually someone here with ill intentions and I didn't call the police, I would get in more trouble. I was completely at a loss at what to do. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Hard, heavy footsteps outside the office door. Impossible, I thought. We hadn't seen anyone on the cameras coming this way. There was no way for him to be back here without us noticing. I suddenly felt dizzy, nauseous, and out of breath. My hands started shaking and my knees felt weak. I had felt this before. Suddenly, imminent and certain danger. I had to get us out of this building. It wasn't until this point that I realized this wasn't something I could just rationalize. This was beyond explanation, but explanation didn't matter. Not right now. Right now, we needed to run. It didn't even cross my mind to lock the door and call the police, for some reason that didn't seem to make sense at the time. This thing, whatever it was at the back of the building now, which means our best bet was to run out the front. I grabbed Kim's coat and threw it at her. "We have to make a run for it." She nodded and put her coat on, grabbed her purse and nodded at me. I grabbed my keys, leaving my coat and backpack completely, and grasped the handle. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but at this point I think I was acting purely on instinct and intuition, as nothing about my actions made sense to my rational mind now. I ripped open the door, and we ran. I'll admit I didn't even look back. I could feel it. I knew something or someone was there. I could feel its eyes on me. It felt like the back of my neck was on fire. We ran. I could have easily outran Kim, but I stayed a few steps behind her, making sure she got out first. She hit the front doors hard. She unlocked them quickly and was out of the store faster than I've ever seen anyone move. She was at her car in no time, getting in, sobbing. I, however, had stopped just outside the front doors. I stood in the snow and cool, silent night air and watched as she tore out of the parking lot. I stood there for what felt like hours, collecting my breath, and turned slowly to face the building, the light still shining brightly out of the full face of windows. I couldn't leave the store like that. I was terrified beyond belief, my hands and knees shaking, but I couldn't leave the store, lights on, unlocked, alarm unarmed all night. So full of fear of losing my job and fear of what was in that building, I went back in. The store was completely silent. There was no movement, no shuffling, no footsteps, nothing. Even the heavy feeling of danger I had felt so strongly before was completely gone. I slid sideways over the alarm system. I punched in my code and hit the arm. The system beeped and didn't arm. I stiffened and turned to face the system. Motion error section 5. I urgently typed my code in again and hit arm. Motion error section 4. The alarm system wouldn't arm if it detected motion in the building. This way it wouldn't be able to be set during business hours or when employees were still in the building. The only way it would set was if there was only motion in section 1, the front of the store. After it was set, employees would have 30 seconds to get out of the building before it would actually set for the night. This was telling me there was motion in the back of the store heading up to the front. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry and yell and tell this thing to leave me alone. I was tired, I was afraid, and I was angry. I punched in my code, hit system override, armed the building, turned off the lights, and ran out that store. I slammed and locked the doors behind me and stepped back into the snow. Everything was silent again, calm and silent. I stared at those doors for what seemed like another hour before finally turning around and going home for the night. I had hoped to see someone. I had hoped this man would pop out and try to leave the building, setting off the alarm, but nothing moved in that store. Not while I was watching it, at least. I went home that night, crawled into bed, and cried in my boyfriend's arms until finally falling asleep as the sun rose. Of course, I had to go back the next morning. I felt almost hungover as I dragged myself through the snow to the front doors of that awful place, really debating if I needed this job. To my surprise, I wasn't the first person to show up. As I arrived, my general manager stood shivering in the snow in front of the building with a police officer. My heart dropped. The lock had been broken off the doors from the inside and had tripped the alarm. The police had arrived, finding nothing in the building, nothing stolen, and no footprints in the snow. The alarm company had woken my boss and told her the alarm had been tripped, and she arrived to the store the same time as the officer. Her expression was of pure rage. I had hoped nothing would be amiss and I wouldn't have to tell her. With a big sigh, I explained to her and the officer what we experienced that night. They, of course, didn't believe a word of it. The policeman left, assuming the door had been broken by wind or something of the like, and simply asked for security footage if we chose to send it. I was taken to the office to review camera footage. My boss sat in silence as she reviewed my whole night, only commenting on the fact I didn't finish my paperwork. The camera showed nothing, only Kim and I running around looking like lunatics. It was after I left that anything tangible showed up. It was the front doors, clearly locked and armed, swinging open at 3 a.m. effortlessly, and the locks dropping off them as if they were not fastened to the doors at all. Jess arrived shortly after, obviously to take over my shift as I was being sent home. When asked about the incident, she of course knew nothing and swore she had gone straight home without ever touching the walkie-talkies. My only other hope for redemption would be Kim's story. I hadn't experienced this alone, and I knew she would back me up. The problem was, Kim never returned to work. She never showed up for her shift, she never answered another phone call, and she never came to pick up her last check. Last I heard of her was through another coworker who simply said she had moved back in with her parents in Arizona. I put in my 2 weeks that night. We moved back home to where we felt the most comfortable, and 7 months later that store closed permanently for cost-related reasons. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and on everything I hold dear, I swear it's true. I simply wish I had some evidence to back it up. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I've had a few strange experiences in my life. But there's one in particular that stands out. I finally decided to share it. I've also added a picture that I took around the same time, which I will explain in the context of the story. Decide for yourself what you think. I can only assure you that the picture is not altered and that my story, as I experienced it, is completely true. First, I think it will be useful to provide a little backstory. My childhood home was very old and burned down due to faulty wiring when I was in the 8th grade. My family decided to rebuild on the same spot, and 6 months later, we were living in an essentially reincarnated version of the old house. The layout was almost exactly the same as before. I always used to joke that our new house was haunted by the spirit of the old, but in secret, I sort of believed it was true. When we moved into the house 2.0, I took a different room than I had stayed in before. I had never liked that my old room faced the street, since it had large, low windows that anyone could look directly into if they had hopped our short wooden fence. Instead, I took the room on the opposite side of the hallway, which in its previous life had simply been a storage room. Another interesting bit of backstory is that I have always suffered terrible insomnia and am prone to nightmares when I do sleep. As a small child, I often had nightmares that would bring my parents rushing into my room, not knowing what I'd do as I screamed and cried totally unconscious. However, I hadn't had an experience that extreme for many years before the time my story takes place, and I had never felt that there was something unusual happening in the house. I was 15. I hadn't been staying in my new bedroom for very long before I started to have terrible nightmares all the time. At first, I didn't think much of it, since I had a history with bad dreams. I figured it was just a psychological pattern that was bound to return. But then I began to notice other things, little things, that increased my feeling of uneasiness. In the given picture, you can see there is a small window directly to the overhead of my bed. I began to feel like someone was outside watching me at night. Many nights, as time went on, almost every night, I would also hear quiet shuffling directly outside that window. It was always just after I went to bed, as it often takes me a long time to fall asleep. There was a line of bushes all along the side of the house my room faced, and I could distinctly hear movement in the gravel below my window, the disturbances of branches, and the most disturbing thing of all, what sounded like fingernails, lightly scraping up or down the mesh screen. I am admittedly an easily startled person. When this first began to happen, I would freeze, suddenly fully awake, and wait for several minutes before timidly peeking between my blinds to see if I could spot anything. I never did. It kept me up many nights, but after a while, the experience became so regular, and nothing besides the noises would occur, so I gradually got used to ignoring it. I tried to tell myself it was birds or other small animals. We live in a very rural area, and that they must sleep in our bushes at night for safety. But some months later, things began to escalate. My dreams were no longer simply bad, but full-blown terrifying. I would sometimes wake up crying, totally in shock, and sit with the lights on for the rest of the night. Once I could swear I heard our front door open and slam shut in the middle of the night, but when I checked, it was still locked and everything was quiet. This was bad enough, but then I began to have experiences with sleep paralysis. Of course, it was always scary when this happened, but there's one night in particular that stands out. I was having a particularly terrifying dream, one that only became bad after a dark figure appeared in it, upsetting an otherwise normal series of events and forcing me awake. I knew I was paralyzed right away. The room felt very strange. Many people describe paranormal presences as chilling, but for me, everything was uncomfortably warm, and it faintly smelled like something was burning. It was too quiet, as if sound had been sucked out of the room. I was able to look around just a little bit, and in my peripheral vision I saw it, the blurry dark figure, the same as in my dream, standing near the edge of my bed, just watching me. I felt like it was moving closer, slowly as to be nearly imperceptible. I could feel myself crying, struggling to break free. I wish I could describe how I felt in that moment. It was beyond fear. It was a terror so huge that it felt more like despair. It was nauseating. I had never felt anything that awful before or since. This silent suffering went on for what felt like hours, the figure creeping nearer to my face, before finally exhaustion and stress caused me to lose consciousness again. Things were relatively quiet after that, aside from the sounds at the window. Plus, I had read about sleep paralysis experiences before and their commonalities, so I didn't think my story was particularly unique. But a couple of months after that last nightmare, I found this picture. I was just bored and looking through pictures on my phone, probably trying to delete some from memory space. I don't remember exactly which night I took this picture. I only know it wasn't the same night as the paralysis, but I remember taking the selfies. There were a few others in this set, taken in quick succession, but for some reason I got distracted and leaned away during this picture, exposing the window behind me. I never bothered to look closely at it before, but in the right lighting, that thing in the window became visible to me. Here I brought up the fill light in the image somewhat and sharpened it to make the shape more clear. Before anyone asked, the window was open in this image. What you're seeing cannot be a reflection, since the mesh screen does not reflect. To me, it looks like the torso of something dark standing directly against the window. To me, it looks like something that could have made all of those noises. The shuffling, the tapping, the scraping of nails. I've shown several people over the years, and while we don't always agree on what it looks like, everyone agrees that something is there and that the images make them feel uneasy. Since that night, I'm grateful to report I haven't experienced anything remotely like this. I still heard the noises outside for a long time, but since moving out of my parents' house, I've never heard them again. All that remains is a mild sense of uneasiness whenever I sleep in that room, and only after the lights go out. This is a true story my dad told me a few years ago. It takes place when he was in his early teens, if I remember correctly. He is not one to make things like this up, so I believe him wholeheartedly. He was in the car with his dad, and they were having a casual conversation when, all of a sudden, he got the feeling of déjà vu, but it wasn't just an ordinary I've done this before type of déjà vu. Along with this feeling came the knowledge of what his dad was going to say next, and what he was supposed to say in response to what his dad was saying. This went on for several minutes, With him just following the script of the conversation, everything was going exactly as he knew it would. After a while of this, he decided he wasn't going to follow the script anymore. He knew what he was supposed to say next, but he purposely said something different. The feeling immediately went away and has never come back since. I think about this pretty often. If he had continued to follow the script of the conversation and even beyond, where would he have ended up in life? If it was some glitch or accident that he became aware of this, does that mean we're all following our own script and are unaware of it? I have a few theories about this, but at the end of the day, all I can do is wonder. The holidays are just around the corner. How's your holiday shopping going? Personally, I've been struggling to find the perfect gift for loved ones. I really wanted to buy my parents something that has meaning. For a really special gift for the special people in your life, you gotta check out the Skylight Frame. Skylight Frame is a photo frame you can update instantly by email from anywhere. It sets up effortlessly in under 60 seconds. Just plug it in, use the touchscreen to connect to your wireless network, and enjoy. Sending photos to Skylight is effortless. Everyone in the family can just email them to your personal Skylight email address and they'll pop up in seconds. It is a black frame and a white mat, so it looks like a real photo frame that adds a beautiful touch to your home. Skylight Frame has a gorgeous 10-inch touchscreen. You can swipe through photos with your finger and even tap to thank the person who sent a photo. 100% satisfaction guaranteed. If you don't love your Skylight, they'll offer you a full refund. You can preload it with your favorite photos for a personalized gift. Important pictures of you and your significant others that they didn't even know you had. When I heard about the Skylight Frame, I thought, what a great way to display all the photos from my phone that may otherwise not get seen by my family. And now, as a special holiday offer, you can get $10 off your purchase of a Skylight Frame when you go to skylightframe.com and enter code READ. That's right. To get $10 off your purchase of a Skylight Frame, just go to skylightframe.com and enter code READ. That's skylightframe.com, promo code READ.